Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. So I have a kind of an ambitious topic. I'll try to do my best. After this, unfortunately, no slides. I can't compete with that. All right. So. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the future. Of course, the future never turns out the way we expect. So what I hope to do is actually lay out a framework, a way of thinking about what's going today, the big trends, and where they're going, that would actually be useful in the future. So most of my actual predictions will probably not turn out that way. But I hope that it will be a very useful way of thinking about it. So. All right, so I'll go straight to the punchline. I think that where we are in health is where computers were in 1980. So that's kind of a big statement. Now, computers, as you know, have been on a roll. Like they started like in the 40s, and it's just been exponential growth all the way till now. It's not even slowing down. But the 80s is an interesting time. Something happened. Anybody want to kind of guess?
Apple computers, personal computers.
Exactly. So they became personal. That was a huge big deal. Before that, it was mainframes. Those very big machines somewhere else that very important people were doing very important things on, like calculating better atom bombs. And then afterwards, it became stuff that you could actually play Space Invaders on at home. Big change. So actually, the most important part of that change is what concerns are being addressed. And I think that we are in the middle of a similar change in health. Now, actually, there's a bunch of trends that actually feed into that transformation. So I'll actually go down the list of those. So, what happened with computers? They got smaller, they got cheaper, they got much more ubiquitous, much more personal. They were personally controlled, individual, you had one. And they got user-friendly, and also they got network effects. So network effects, you probably know what that is. If you're the only person who has email, email is not useful. If everybody has email, it's incredibly useful. So the same things are happening in health right now. We have mainframe medicine. And I'm not actually putting it down. It's amazing, it's fantastic, but it's big. So it's not really responsive. You have to make an appointment a month in advance. And it's big machines, and people have to run them. They have, machines have staff. So the next thing, where are we going? It's going to be, well, let's call it PC medicine. This thing doesn't actually have a name, which actually kind of is early days yet. So I don't know what the equivalent to a PC is, but let's say a health tracker. I'll propose that as a term. And you've seen some health trackers, there's the Basis Watch, Scanable, and lots more devices like that being developed all the time. So that's the health PC, if you will. Now the interesting thing is that the PCs were actually not amazing advances. They were around since the 60s. The Apple came out in 1977, I believe, but they were actually around for a while before that. And even more so, the theoretical advances that led to those were way earlier than that. The first transistors were in the 40s. The first microchips were in the 50s. We have the same thing now. We have all the advances we really need. DNA sequencing, 70s. Immunoassays, also 70s. So the gap between the state-of-the-art in research and the state-of-the-art in practice is really, really huge right now. It's never been bigger. It's going to shrink. And so this next thing that happens in health is going to be driven not by amazing new theoretical advances, but by amazing technological refinements. So that's an important thing. So it doesn't mean that everything actually has been discovered. There will certainly be new fundamental advances, but it means that we're going to have quite a ride even without that. Okay, so I guess I'll go over all the trends real quick. Smaller. EKG machine in 1985. It's probably the size of something like that, a big strip chart recorder. I was working on a similar device, which is a wearable patch today. It's a little bit bigger than a quarter maybe. And I thought that was pretty state of the art. That was last year. Now I talked to the guys at Cortera in Berkeley, and they have something that's the size of a grain of rice. Pretty much does the same job. So how small does it get? I don't know. We'll find out. Cheaper. The human genome actually is an amazing example of that. It was $3 billion to do a first genome in that was actually in 2000. In 2007, it was $10 million. And today, it's $1,000. That's a huge drop. It's much faster than Moore's law. Actually, the second half of that drop is much faster than the first half. So it's only getting cheaper fast, but it's actually getting cheaper even faster over time. Now we're talking about maybe $100 genome a couple of years out. That seems pretty achievable. Then the change in ubiquity kind of goes with a change in price. Everybody can sequence their genome now. Maybe not today, but give it a couple of years and go to a doctor for something routine. They probably want to sequence your genome. And of course, everybody wants to buy these new health tracking devices. More personal, so that's actually perhaps the biggest change. It's kind of a combination of those things coming together. And the reason why is because the concerns that are being addressed change. When you have a basis watch, it doesn't do the same things that you want to address when you get a lab test or when you have an MRI scan. It's very different kinds of concerns. They're complementary. But those were concerns that were not being addressed at all before, in some ways. Now, the other thing, I kind of also want to say, so I'm giving shout-outs to a bunch of companies and projects, and they're amazing, but they're also really early prototypes. When you look at something like the Basis Watch, I want you to think that this is like the Commodore 64 of health, right? It's very limited. It's very amazing at the time, but it's very limited. So in another 20 years, we'd look back on this and say, yes, this had a lot of the things that we've now come to expect and take for granted. It was really clunky. It was still a huge success, by the way. All right, so now network effects. That is, I guess, a lot of that is about data sharing. So, for example, genomic data, if you're the only person who has their genome scanned, that's not terribly useful. The more people you have to compare it against, the more useful it gets. The same with every other kind of data. Another kind of network effect is sharing other information. For example, CrowdMed is working on crowdsourced diagnoses, or Cure Together. They're kind of sharing information about how treatments work. So that's stuff that we don't really have before, and it's just coming into play. All right. The mainframe health doesn't actually go away. Okay, and again, I'm really not putting that down, but it's a way to think about it. It's this big iron thing. Just like mainframes didn't go away, we call them the cloud nowadays. But the difference is that the cloud is actually where you want it, when you want it, it pretty much works for you. It's very responsive. Mainframes are not responsive. You actually have to go to them usually with your data on a punch card. So now, I mean, do you have to make an appointment to log into Gmail? No, I don't think so. You have to make an appointment to get a test done or see a doctor? Yes. That's so 2000, you know? That's like, I think we'll look back on that and be kind of amazed that things really work that way. All right. So this is coming as a second revolution. It is coming after the computer revolution. So it can borrow so many things from that. We have really refined microcircuits and software and stuff that lets us deal with big data. So it's actually much easier, and perhaps it's going to be a much faster revolution. Even today's what I'll describe as rough prototypes are kind of small. They're the size of a watch. They're not the size of a suitcase, right? So that's because this is the second revolution. And there's it's anything, microfluidics, microelectromechanical sensors. All those things are actually being very helpful for that. So I want to talk a little bit, I hope that you guys kind of go off and think about this and think about how we can actually get there faster and better. So how to steer this a little bit. I'm trusting you guys to do that. So, and perhaps kind of having a big framework helps with that. What can we do to actually make this better? Well, I think the biggest thing is to not ban it. So when the FDA wants to regulate mobile medical devices, well, that's probably a really bad idea. Right. So I would actually make a distinction between medical devices and health devices. Medical devices are used to actually diagnose a disease. Health devices are just for tracking health. They're totally different because you won't treat somebody based on data you got from their health device. You might decide to actually do a medical test. So you can say, well, that's a different area. The FDA doesn't apply. You can also say the FDA can be just a little information clearinghouse, particularly for diagnostics. So don't actually decide what diagnostics people can do, but rather say, well, just give us your data on how well it works. And some tests are really bad, but they're still useful. So then people can look at that and decide if they want to use those tests or not. You can also, by the way, combine really bad tests into a single good test. All right. So, share data. That's huge. So, when people do a genome-wide association study today, they usually, it's kind of small, and the data is just used in that. And then the same data could be used in our studies, but there's no mechanism to do that. 23andMe is doing a pretty good job of data sharing, but only, of course, with stuff that you've gotten through their platform. So just have a way to share data really easily, just one click, a standard agreement, standard regulatory framework, and that would actually maximize the value of it. And concentrate on healthy states. So a lot of medicine has been the study of disease. Now, when you wear braces, you're not really trying to figure out if you're sick or not. You want to have more information about a healthy state. Healthy states are things that we don't really understand. Actually, they've never been a strong focus. The things that actually maintain a healthy state. And I think that's going to be super important. And lastly, to have some way that you can actually make money by completely avoiding diseases. So for example, Genentech got started by having a treatment for Gaucher's disease. It's $100,000 a year per patient. So if I actually came up with something that would cure Gaucher's disease, that would be worth, I don't know, $1 million per patient. That would not be a bad deal. There's no way to actually make that money right now. So if there was some kind of mechanism to actually use market mechanisms to encourage people to do that, that would be super useful. So I think it's probably time for me to wrap up. What might the future look like? So I think you'll have monitoring vitals, many other kinds of things which are specialized labs now, all the time, 24/7. If you want, you might have a unit at home, you might wear a unit in your pocket on your wrist. I think actually they'll probably start looking something like jewelry eventually. So if you get really sick, you immediately know. You actually know very early on. Maybe if you're just trending in a bad direction, you know before anything could be diagnosed today. And there's going to be a way to, I'm not actually sure what the good interventions are going to be. Maybe you're like, oh, I noticed there's a little bit of an arrhythmia. So I want to guide you through a guided meditation to steer that back on course. You're not sick, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you, but if you didn't do anything, in 10 years you might have some kind of heart problem. So now's the time to take care of it very easily, very gently. So it's not going to be drugs. It's going to be very gentle stuff. One of the designers of Scanadu said, we're the last generation to know so little about ourselves. I think that's probably true. And so where does it all go? I think if we get this all right, we'll be in a world in which disease, most kinds of disease, are relegated to a kind of a nuisance status. like tuberculosis. Your odds of getting it extremely low. Your odds of dying from it are much lower than that again. So you mostly won't get sick from anything, unless you're unlucky. And then if you do, it would actually be easy to correct. It comes very early on. So that's where I think we're headed. 20 years. It might happen faster. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
So just using the mainframe healthcare metaphor, which I think is an excellent way to look at it. One of the problems is when Jobs was first starting Apple, right, because he wanted to do this one-to-one ratio, all of this commercial strategy of how to do distribution was solely focused on direct to consumer.
Yep.
Right? And the analogy, right, that computers didn't have to deal with, that we have to deal with in healthcare, is that the FDA, right, is very ambitious as an organization. And as someone once said, you know, the worst thing you can do is when you have someone who's like really ambitious and smart and intelligent become the leader of a government organization, right? Because they just want to grow, like they just grow that organization as the sensory of scale. So how do we do direct-to-consumer health, new ways of healthcare?
Avoiding the FDA? Well, I think the movement for FDA reform is probably something that's time has come. But I think the FDA is, you have to understand their motivation. They're very risk adverse. They're afraid that unless they do their job, bad things are going to happen. People are going to take unnecessary treatments, they're going to take treatments that are very dangerous. So they're fundamentally driven by risk aversion. And the thing is, that's great for some areas, but for other areas it just doesn't apply. It's not something you want to use across the board. If you have some kind of test which is really, really bad but useful, you want to do that test. You think that people won't pay for it out of pocket, why not? So I think it has to be applied only where appropriate. The worst case of the FDA actually is they regulate treatments for Huntington's disease. I think most people with Huntington's disease are extremely not risk averse because they're going to die unless they do something pretty drastic. But the FDA still requires a control group for Huntington's. That's just kind of evil, So I think the FDA is pushing to regulate mobile devices. I think people will probably push back. I hope so. If not, this is going to happen in a different country. It's not going to happen here. So just move it.